Albert Einstein said, "Don't think about why you question, simply don't stop questioning." Welcome to Curated Questions. I am your host, Ken Woodward. And these questions are not mathematical equations, but rather a resource to encounter personal reflection and growth. As Tupac Shakur stated, even the genius asks questions. Now, let's engage the questioning community.
Greetings. Ken Woodward here. Welcome back to another episode of Curated Questions. Together, we engage inquisitive humans about how they use questions to navigate and make sense of our world. I am a fellow traveler and pilgrim on this journey, and I'm glad you are here. Today's conversation is with Jerry Colonna. Jerry is a coach, writer, and speaker who focuses on leadership, business, and radical self-inquiry. For over 2 decades, he has been dedicated to the proposition that work should be nonviolent to the self, community, and planet. He is the host of the Reboot Podcast and the co-founder of Reboot.io, a company founded on the belief that work does not have to destroy us, but rather how we achieve our fullest potential. Jerry helps people lead with humility and equanimity. His unique blend of Buddhism, Jungian therapy, and entrepreneurial expertise has resulted in working with some of the largest firms in the U.S. In his work as a coach, he draws on his experience in venture capital as co-founder of Flatiron Partners, one of the most successful early-stage investment programs in the New York City area. Jerry is the author of 2 books, Reboot Leadership and the Art of Growing Up, and most recently, Reunion, Leadership and the Longing to Belong. I invited Jerry into conversation because of his thoughtful use of questions. We will discuss one of his core questions, which I have personally used to navigate life and witnessed the power in the lives of others. His unflinching desire to see life's reality, step into all that we can become, and call us into belonging is not for the faint of heart, but it results in being fully alive. Jerry, welcome to Curated Questions.
Oh, well, thanks for having me. And my goodness, what a beautiful introduction. I wish everybody listening to the show would at some point in their life be introduced with the care that you introduced me. So thank you for that. I appreciate it.
You are quite welcome, and I am very grateful for your work on many fronts. Mm-hmm. So I'd just like to start by asking, when did you first understand the power of questions?
Well, that itself is a brilliant question. And I've been sitting here thinking about it, sitting with the question. And my first conscious response would be when I was a reporter back in my early 20s. I would argue that the skills that I developed as a reporter served me well, not only when I was an investor, but also when I was a coach. But then I had another thought that I wanted to share, which was the experience that I had growing up, which was don't ask questions, which was see and observe certain experience and phenomena, but don't say anything about it. And certainly don't ask questions. And yes, one response to your question would be, I think I first experienced a liberation that came from following my curiosity when I was a young reporter, following my late teen years, in which my depression was so intense that the silence and the non-questioning that I grew up with, I couldn't bear it anymore. So this is a long-winded way of making my way to a really interesting place, which was the realization for the first time in my life, the realization right now of how powerful and important it was that I began to ask questions as a living, as a reporter. So how's that for an answer?
I'll take it. That's beautiful. And appreciate how you also bookended both the presence of questions and the absence of questions are wrapped within that and provide a through line within the story.
That's right.
And you're also able to acknowledge and appreciate that both of them exist. That's cool.
Yeah. It's understanding by appreciating the negative experience, right? Seeing that it's almost like in my 20s, liberated from the confines of not speaking about what I was seeing. And not to make it all mysterious, but as a child, I grew up with a mentally ill mother and an alcoholic father, and a tremendous amount of conflict and lack of safety. And one of the ways that we maintained the lack of safety was we didn't ask questions. We didn't challenge things. We wouldn't even say out loud what was going on. But to realize that following my significant depressive episode at 18 and following that at 21 becoming a reporter, how ironic, where I started to get paid for asking probing questions and asking questions that might actually be uncomfortable for the system that we were operating in. So
when you think about that time in regarding that switch, do you recall any particular feeling of liberation, or does anything now come to mind regarding thinking about that freedom?
Yeah, if I think back, and if we were a 1970s TV show, the screen would get all wavy, right? Because it would be a flashback. So flashing back, I remember being a kind of go-getter young reporter, famous in journalism. We'll say, we talk about the get. Did you get a get, right? And a get is like an unbelievable interview. How did you get that one, right? And I remember having a get and getting a CEO to sit down and talk. And I remember the experience when there was one CEO who I had gotten quite close to, a guy named Chuck Exley, who was the CEO of NCR Corporation, which way back used to be a powerhouse in computers. It still has massive technology advantages, but we know them as the cash register company that they first began as in ATMs. And I remember when Chuck was retiring, I had already developed a relationship with him. And I remember asking him about his father, because I was doing a sort of exit Q&A with him and asking about stepping down and what was it like to step down. And asking him about his experience watching his own father retire. Now, in hindsight, I was 21, 22, 23 years old. I mean, what the heck was I doing asking questions like that? But he teared up. And I did not expect that. I mean, here was a captain of industry. And then, still in flashback mode, thinking back to many of the interviews that I ended up doing, I developed a bit of a reputation, kind of like I was the Barbara Walters of the information technology industry, where I would ask questions that would cause people to cry. And I wasn't seeking to do that. I was genuinely, personally curious about their experience. Looking backwards, I wasn't coaching. I wasn't asking a question that was designed to help them unpack something or to know something about themselves. I was genuinely curious about the experience that they were going through. So.
It is quite remarkable as I think about a 21-year-old asking the questions. I don't know. I mean, amazing insight. Just to even think as a 21-year-old, I don't know if you had necessarily the formal training that says these are the types of questions that you ask or go after. I don't know if I would have ever had the idea to connect those points in this case. So just love the fact that, or love that you're able to get that result and insight.
I think that, I'm 61 now. And from the vantage point of being 61 and looking back on a 40-year career. Questions were at the heart of every single career move that I made. First as a reporter, then as an investor, now as a coach. And behind the questions was always a genuine curiosity about the other person's experience. I'll tell you another very quick story. One of the stories I did when I was in my 20s, and my editor had given me a lot of leeway and freedom to do this story. I'd proven myself as a good reporter, not only for getting the get, but also for really being able to do things. Later, I ended up becoming editor of the magazine. But I remember I was really curious about one experience. So way back, there was a company called Control Data Corporation, and it was based in Minneapolis. And it was founded by a guy named Bill Norris and another guy named Seymour Cray. There were a few other people as well. And they grew out of work done in the 1950s and 1960s on what was then called supercomputing. And they built some of the highest functioning calculating machines that were initially used to compute the trajectory for missiles used by the Navy. So if you think about it, it's a complex thing. You've got a ship that's moving in multiple directions. It's trying to hit a target many miles away. There's velocity, there's wind, there's all these factors that you have to calculate in order to accurately fire a missile. And originally, these were done by human beings and making hand calculations, and then eventually computers started taking over. Anyway, Norris was a cantankerous, curmudgeonly kind of guy. And he was a kind of Midwestern progressive. Tim Walz reminds me of him. He's a kind of like, you just take care of your neighbor kind of person, right? He wasn't radical in any sense, but there were things that he was criticized for. In the late 1960s, there were a number of riots in the United States, and some would call them economic riots, some would call them race riots, but there was a notion of places like Watts and Newark were burning. And their response, Control Data's response, was to place factories in economically challenged areas, places like St. Paul, Minnesota, or Brooklyn, New York, East New York, because the theory was if you give people jobs, you improve their lives. Again, a very pragmatic and progressive point of view. And they were pillared for this. Wall Street hated it because your profitability went down. Because, why would you place a factory in this area? And I was fascinated by this. And so I remember going out to Minnesota, and Norris was probably in his 80s when I was interviewing him. And I asked him about the experience. I said, why would you do this? And he told me a story of growing up in Nebraska during the Depression. And all the other farmers were losing cattle because the drought meant no hay meant no feed meant dead cattle. And Norris said, so I started feeding our cattle thistles. Now, cows they don't like thistles. And he further explained to me that when everybody starts to go south, he had a hankering to go north. So when everybody said, move manufacturing overseas, he said, no, I'm going to move it to Brooklyn, New York. And it was the power of genuine curiosity between what he was doing in that moment and why he was the way he was and how that was rooted in his childhood. That, again, through the magic of looking backwards, I can see almost a theme to my 40 years of work. Just being darn curious. Ken, Why are questions so important to you? Right? Why is this experience so important? So I will say that by approaching other people with that curiosity, I am a better man because of it, because I have grown and learned.
I've been on a similar journey in being impacted by the stories of others and encountering remarkable growth. And as a result of it, I would argue that if 10 years ago you said this is where you're going to be at today, 10 years later, there'd be a lot of side-eye happening. But especially with the work you're doing through the coaching and the questions that you've been using, and by really becoming, as you say, the label of the coach that makes people cry. And let's be clear, that's because of the care, not because of brutality. So we'll make sure that that's clear.
Right.
But to your point, that really has been consistent, even starting with the journalism early on. So this has been a consistent path or through line for you. Wow.
It has absolutely been a consistent path. And to be clear, sometimes the questions can be so painful that they feel brutal. But I don't really ask other people questions that I myself am not asking of myself. So another angle into your very first question would be when I started journaling, which I was 13, 14 years old. And the questions that I would ask of myself in my journal were not particularly sophisticated, but powerful. Why am I feeling the way I'm feeling? Or even more elemental, what is it that I'm actually feeling? You know, you made reference to this language around me. Oh, this is the guy who makes people cry. And I always point out that what feels radical in that moment is that I will ask questions that are more often than not glossed over. And something as simple as, how are you feeling in this moment? You know, I'll put you a little on the spot. You know, we're recording now in a kind of plan B software because plan A wasn't working. And I didn't ask at the time, but what I was feeling was a kind of nervousness on your part, a fear about maybe it wasn't going to come about in a conversation. I know I myself was wondering if I had done something wrong, you know, because we're all dealing with technology. Did I click the wrong button kind of thing? And so I think I entered a curious, empathetic state. And I didn't give voice to the question, but the question I was holding was, how's my friend Ken feeling? Because I know that if it were me who had set up this conversation, I would be feeling fill in the blank. Frustrated, ashamed, a little bit confused, you know, any of those feelings. And I say all this because by asking myself those questions in my journaling process, which continues daily to this day, by asking myself those questions and subjecting myself to those questions, first on a psychoanalytic couch, literally lying on my back like a New Yorker cartoon, right? And asking those questions of the world. Why does the world behave the way we do? Why are we attracted to powerful people in the way we are? Why do we set aside what we say are our values only to pursue what seems to be a destructive course? Why do we treat each other the way we treat each other? Why do we allow babies to carry guns and kill each other? Right? And by babies, I mean teenagers who are still babies in my heart. I don't know any other way to get at the truth except to ask questions. And I don't know how we change the world, whether it's the inner world of our own selves or the outer world in which we're trying to operate, without questioning reality. Why is the world the way it is? And more important, what do I have to give up that I love or that makes me feel safe so that the world can be a little bit better, so that the climate doesn't feel a threat?
Those are very poignant questions based on where we happen to be at right now when we're recording this, a week before a presidential election in the United States in 2024. And so that by the time this hits the podcast ecosystem, the answer will have been out there and we'll have been processing through it. So that idea of what must I give up so that everybody feels safer? What does that look like in how we hold everything?
Yeah. You know, Ken, there's something empowering about a question like that, isn't there? Because behind the question is an implicit belief, which is that I can make a difference. It's a hopeful statement, right? It's my infamous question, which I know you referenced a little bit before. How have I been complicit in creating the conditions I say I don't want? That's my famous question, which I should have trademarked because I'd be a bazillionaire now. I'm kidding. Behind that question is a belief in the possibility for human beings to grow and change. See, when we don't weaponize questions, when we don't turn questions into a means of making you feel small. Ken, have you ever considered therapy? Right? That's a weaponized question. That's not an open, honest question, as our Quaker friends have taught us, as my teacher and mentor Parker Palmer has taught me, right? But when a question embodies hope, embodies possibility, when it recognizes the reality of a current situation, when it is fierce with the reality, why do we find ourselves attracted to? Why do we as a populace find ourselves attracted to someone who appears to be grandiose and narcissistic? And by the way, we could say, well, he's talking about one person or another. But the truth of the matter is, we have had a complex relationship with demagogues since the country was founded. And yet, it's not even limited to the United States. Why is it that human beings, when they gather together, set aside their own best interest or the best interest of the community in order to pursue what they perceive to be their own needs for love, safety, and belonging? What is it about the experience of being a human being and maybe perhaps an inability to understand our relationship to fear that leads us to self-sabotage, our communities, our individuals?
In Reunion, your latest book, you had a question: how can we move to the systemic belonging of beloved community? And when I first read that, I wrote in the margin 2 questions. Who benefits from your fear and who gave you your boogeyman? That's what I was thinking as I reflected on the question. And because fear is so cheap and so reliable to drive behavior, to get a response, and in this political moment that we're in, to consider how often fear is just thrown around indiscriminately, making or othering the other, and just trying to sow fear, and then being able to say, but I am your only savior, so vote for me. Just the carnage that is left behind in all of our communities.
Yeah.
It's just brutal.
Yeah. Over this past weekend, I reached back in time, another flashback, right, back to college, and I reread an essay by Richard Hofstadter, which I highly recommend. And it became the title of a collection of essays that he wrote. Hofstadter was a historian and social commentator, and he wrote this essay just after Goldwater had been nominated for the Republican nomination for the 1964 election, I believe it was. And the essay is called The Paranoid Style of American Politics. And what he describes as the paranoid style is this use of the cultivation of populist fear with a mixture of conspiracy theory to reinforce a negative view of the community to ensure power is in the hands of a select group of people. He's not describing current times. In fact, he cites 4 different examples, one each from different millennia in the United States, going back to the 17th century. And what he talks about is there is something in the collective psyche of this extraordinary experiment called America that creates the conditions where those who seek to close the wounds of their own experience, their wounds to their narcissistic sense of self, which we all have, who then use demagoguery to attempt to quench the unquenchable thirst for power. If you remember from Reunion, I talked about the Buddhist concept of hungry ghosts, right? Wraith-like figures who haunt the world, never able to be satisfied. And what gets sacrificed in the bid to quench that unquenchable feeling is the unity, the natural state of interdependence and interbeing between Ken and Jerry. The ability to empathetically imagine what's it like to be in your body, so that the questions that I ask, so that the experience I have of being in relationship to you, so that I can hear your story, evoke not only belonging for you, but belonging for me. That gets sacrificed. This bid for power, for safety, for status, for ego. And it's not too big a stretch to then draw a line that basically says, and so then 13-year-olds who should be in school are instead carrying AK-47 or AR-15s and shooting up their classmates. Because that's what we've come to. This is where we are. This is where we are. And that is not the world I say I want to have. And what is it that I have to give up that makes me feel safe so that the conditions of the world create belonging for everyone?
I appreciate Reunion, where you lay out so much of your backstory, your origin story, if you will, and all that you've lived and walked through, and as you paint a picture for what true belonging looks like. A reason that I appreciate the example is that I've had a chance to connect with other people and hear stories. And, you know, being a middle-aged, white, cisgendered Christian guy, this is what America was built or optimized for someone like me. And I didn't realize this until recent years. But as I've had opportunities for conversations with anyone that doesn't fit this particular mold and heard the stories and been exposed to that gap between what is today and full belonging, it's just that much greater because of all these other hindrances that are in the way. I mean, it's a majestic and great hope, and yet one that at least has to be planted, right? And the pole has to be planted and say, this is what it looks like. This is your example. This is the belonging. This is the way, this is where we're going. And let's have a collective look at, this is where we need to be moving. And how can we get there?
And not give in to a Pollyanna kind of experience where we presume that the forces that would hold us back from that state are going to lay down their arms, right? There is, you'll know it better than I. There is this image. I think it was Moses who was unable to enter the kingdom of Israel, but he had to only see it from a distance because of his own failings. Like Moses, we may not enter that kingdom, but that doesn't absolve us of the responsibility of creating that kingdom for others. Rabbi Tarfon in the Talmud, I quote this in Reunion, said, "It is not yours to complete the work, but neither are you at liberty to neglect the work." It is not yours to complete the work, but neither are you at liberty to neglect the work. Because those of us for whom this system has been built, you and me and others like us, we could throw up our hands and say, we'll never achieve. So why bother? We'll never achieve a state where hate is eliminated. We'll never achieve a state of persistent systemic belonging. So why bother? And that is cowardice.
As I was reading Reunion, it highlighted one of the things that I'd really been struggling with. In my journey, it wasn't until the last 8 years or so that I had my eyes open to understanding the real history of America, all of the impact of the different formal and informal ways in which oppression and all of these structures that we put in place to build the systems and the systemic elements we have today. So in my learning, I became very angry with my ancestors. First, for the silence and not teaching or passing along or even having conversations about the truth. But then it became, I don't come from a long line of abolitionists or anyone in that world, if you will. It's always been adhere to the systems. I was taught don't push back against the systems. The systems are just, right, moral. And so there's been this reckoning in my mind, whereas I look at my lineage, I'm like, why haven't you been the courageous ones? Because you have given me this world in which I exist today. It's one thing if I look back and I'm like, oh, for the last umpteen generations, we've had this long, glorious history of justice and righteousness fighting against oppression. But it's not. And as I did some looking in our history, I was completely open after I had done a bunch of this reading. I was like, I wouldn't be the least bit surprised if someone in our family had been enslavers and just own all of our history. I was like, okay, this is probably the case because we've been here for a while. I mean, the family certainly participated in the elements of the systems that were in place at the time. But in Reunion, where you're talking about essentially going back and engaging with our ancestors, like through our imagination and such, and recognizing who they were,
Right.
the world in which they live, what courage looked like or not, and being able to work through that has been really helpful. I haven't come all the way through it at all, but I've spent all this other time going through this reckoning and finding out, realizing it's ongoing, and I want it to be different.
Right.
And so then it becomes, to your point on this, here we are today. So the courage must be mine, and I need to have the courage to push back and to be a part of that change. Because I don't want the generations that follow me to look back and go, there's nobody in my line. I'm like, nope, I'm going to be a part of this. This will be the generation where there's going to be some change in this particular area. It's just, nope, this is my role. So hopefully it can be a little bit different in the future.
God bless you for pausing and even being able to do that. I want to recognize the enormity of what you just shared. It's really critical. It's really important. I see on your bookshelf a copy of James Baldwin's essays, The Price of the Ticket. And in the essay, The Price of the Ticket, he talks about the price of the ticket of whiteness is a disconnection, dismemberment from the reality of who our ancestors were and what their experience is. In my own journey, and in that which I think many other folks who are descended from Europeans, like me, there is a kind of whitewashing, pun intended, of the history and a mythologizing of the struggles. And the result is that certain questions, to go back to our theme, go unanswered. Like in the back of Reunion, in the afterword, I turn the mic over to 3 different women and they write essays. And one of the women, Virginia Bauman, who identifies as queer, asks the question about her members in her family tree. What happened to the queer members? Because they existed. It's part of the human experience. What happened to the people who felt gender dysmorphia or misgendered? Because they existed. Even if they didn't act out. Even if they weren't allowed the space to express who they were. What happened to those who were victimized by child sexual abuse? Because they existed, but they're not part of the mythology. What happened to the enslavers? What happened to the people who profited? What happened to the people who themselves were enslaved? Right? One young man came up to me at a boot camp, what we refer to as our retreats, while I was writing Reunion, and he said, my great-grandmother was raped by my great-grandfather. She was enslaved by him. And I asked him what was her name. And he broke down in tears because she is lost in time, dismembered from the family tree. She is an ancestor. See, I ended up going there because I put myself into a question. I put myself into a challenge. And as you know from reading Reunion, my daughter Emma, who was protesting the murder of George Floyd, challenged her father. Yeah, Dad, you talk about better humans making better leaders, but what does it mean to be a better human when adult men died under the knee of a cop? What does it mean in the 21st century in America? What does it mean to be a better human under these conditions? This may sound political. I think of this as moral, but apolitical, beyond politics. This is about morality. This is about a society that allows people to be murdered in their beds with a no-knock warrant. Because we all are complicit in that. And so the animated question became, how have I been complicit in and benefited from the conditions in the world I say I don't want to see? How do I strip away the blinders that mythology creates? It is true that America is an incredible experiment. It is true. There have been more democratic freedoms given to the citizens of these United States than in any other country in history. But it is equally true that America has never always been America for others, as Langston Hughes wrote in the poem. America has never always been America for everyone. But it can be. There's that hope again. But it can be. Because it is not us to complete the work, but neither are we at liberty to neglect the work. And the work is both internal to us. Who were my ancestors? Who am I? How was I brought to this spot in this time, given this task of changing the pattern so that my descendants live a different life? What is the work that I have to do to change the trajectory of our community? Because I have work to do.
What is the posture one should have as they approach a question to be able to get everything that it has to offer?
The posture, the stance, to really have a question like the questions we've been working with today, work their magic, we have to be fierce with reality, which is a Parkerism. We have to be brave enough to withstand the answer. I wrote about this when I was writing Reunion. There was a moment in which I was really struggling. I mean, there were many moments when I was struggling with that book. Oh my God, tortured nightmares. And I think it's August 2nd is Baldwin's birthday, and as is often the case when an important person in our culture has a birthday come up, the internet is flooded with quotes, sometimes false quotes from about the person, like the Buddha saying, drop that shit. No, the Buddha never said that.
But it's a meme on the internet. It must be true. Come on. But, I don't know what you're saying.
But it's a meme. Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. But there was this quote that was floating around, and it apparently comes from an interview Baldwin did with the New York Times. And I'm going to mangle the quote, not get it right. But he said something like, when I'm writing about the things about which I don't want to know. I'm writing about the things I don't want to know. And that felt really resonant with me. Because if we are willing to ask questions about the things we don't want to know, there is a liberation in the answers, however painful it is. I'll give you a good example. As you know from reading Reunion, part of the sub-story, part of my own inner exploration was to really try to understand my father's drinking, or more specifically, why my father did not respond to my mother's mentally ill ravings, and how distorting that was for me. She's talking to Jesus in the kitchen, and no one is noting that Jesus is actually not there. She wasn't praying. She was like having a conversation and a cup of tea. Okay? And so why would my father not call that out? Why would my father not give me a sense of safety by at least turning to me and saying, you're not being gaslighted. You see reality. I see reality too. And so in trying to understand what it was about my father, I ended up back telling the story about how on his wedding day to my mother, his mother stood at the back of the church so angry at marrying my mother that she first called my mother a whore because she was pregnant with my brother, and then announced to the whole congregation that he was not her son, that he had been adopted. And that's how he found out that he was adopted. Then, to close the loop, as you know from the book, I then understand and undertake to understand who his birth mother was. And how could a young woman at 20 give up a child who was 18 months old? Not 18 weeks, not 18 hours, 18 months. He had a name, he was walking, he was probably talking, he probably called her mama. How did she give him up for adoption? And what was it like for my father to have lost not just one mother, you're not my son, you were adopted, but the other mother? And what does it do to a man to have that as the backdrop and to have a mentally ill wife who could sit at a kitchen table talking to Jesus. Maybe that's why he drank. I didn't want to know the answers to my questions. I didn't want to know why my biological grandmother gave up my father for adoption. I was so mad at her, so angry at her, that I denied my Irish ethnicity. And so my pilgrimage to Ireland in the summer of 2022, to her gravesite in a churchyard in Moycarkey, my journey, my pilgrimage to walk amongst the bones of my ancestors and my kin, was that kind of reunion with the dismembered parts of my past. These people lived, they loved, they fought, they died, they were angry, they cried, they starved, they probably were physically abusive, they probably drank. They were human. They were flesh and blood. They are part of me. And I am as a part of that soil as my ancestors whose bones are disintegrating into the ground right now.
I thought about a piece of your story the other day when you recounted, this is what my mother or grandmother would have seen as you had walked some of those old towns and roadways. I was walking around looking at trees and projecting into the future when generations might look back and walk under these same trees and know we both saw the same thing.
Yeah.
And it's like, no kidding. Our ancestors would have observed these same places, and it was what helped make them.
That's right. I'm reaching for a poem, to me, which illustrates what we're talking about. The notion of what does the light look like from that spot of land. And this is by the poet Joy Harjo. And she writes, the name of the poem is Remember. Remember the sky that you were born under. Know each of the stars' stories. Remember the moon. Know who she is. Remember the sun's birth at dawn. That is the strongest point of time. Remember sundown and the giving away to night. Remember your birth, how your mother struggled to give you form and breath. You are evidence of her life and her mother's and hers. Remember your father. He is your life also. Remember the earth whose skin you are. Red earth, black earth, yellow earth, white earth, brown earth. We are earth. Remember the plants, trees, animal life. All have their tribes, their families, their histories too. Talk to them. Listen to them. They are alive poems. Remember the wind. Remember her voice. She knows the origin of this universe. Remember, you are all people and all people are you. Remember, you are this universe and this universe is you. Remember, all is motion, is growing, is you. Remember, language comes from this. Remember the dance language is, that life is. Remember. I think what the poet is teaching us is that great reunification, the great overcoming of divisiveness, the great overcoming of separateness requires that we remember what the wind felt on our grandmother's face. And yeah, you have to use active imagination to remember that. But yes, remember what they went through. Remember their anger. Remember their pain. Remember their suffering. remember how they may have beaten a child or enslaved another human. Because not remembering creates disunion. Not remembering creates the empty space in which hungry ghosts are born and utilize power to hurt other people.
There's two elements that come to mind. What do we do today regarding the action of remembering as we think backwards? And secondarily, in the current day of engaging with our children and looking forward in this world of distraction and electronics, it's understanding the tangible world that's out there. Mm-hmm. I mean, today we live on our devices. 3 generations from now, as they're remembering back on us, what will remain? Phones will be gone. Mm. But back to the poet's remembrance of the sense of place and the stars and the wind and the trees and the built environment, those would remain. Mm. So to consider, how can we incorporate some of that remembrance now, such that when those future generations think back, that we have built that memory into us, such that it can be transferred and shared through the generations?
I think if I can extract a kind of practical piece of that, which is, so what do we do? Kind of response, right? That's a question that arises. And what occurs to me, Ken, is that a lot of times I'll be in dialogue, I'll be in conversation, either client or it might be some speaking event that I do. And someone will mention something. And they'll mention it in passing. And one of the things I've trained myself to do is that when my heart does a little bit of a jump, I pay attention to it. So someone might say, this happened yesterday. Yeah, that was at the time where my wife was diagnosed with a brain tumor. And then they continue with the story. And I go, hold on. And I call them speed bumps, right? Speed bumps exist in the road for us to slow down. And I come back and I say, wait, no, stop. Can we go back? Oh, yeah. And one of the first things I will say is, can you tell me their name? Can you tell me the name of your father? What did you call your grandmother? Oh, I called her Papa. It's Chinese. Or I called her Mama to distinguish from Mom. And what did Mama smell like? I remember talking to a young Egyptian man who had left Egypt, sought political sanctuary in the United States because he was one of the organizers in the protest in Tahrir Square. We forget those protests where the army took down Mubarak and then fired on the protesters at the same time, right? We forget this. And I remember asking him, what does your grandmother smell like? Right? Oh my God, the tears that flowed. And the point is this, you're talking about our descendants looking back. One of the things that makes the way I am weird, radical, is that I endeavor to remember in the moment that we're here by naming. By naming who is the person. Tell me their story. Both out of my own personal curiosity, but also out of the learned wisdom that you naming it helps your experience. I don't want to talk about my wife's name who was diagnosed with a brain tumor because I will feel pain. I get it. But tell me her name anyway. And feel that. Because just like a speed bump, if you hit that speed bump hard, you're going to bottom out the car. Too fast, too hard, not knowing. No, stop, pause, go slowly over the speed bump. Feel the car go up and down. You can survive it because you'll be more whole afterwards, because we incorporate the experience of the other into our experience. Mary Heffernan was my biological grandmother. I get it. I can see her name on the gravestone. I can imagine her uncle, for whom my father, William Michael Heffernan, was originally named. Not merely Jerome Vito Colonna, which was the name his parents gave him. He is the boy with two names. He is both, just as I am both.
I had an experience over the last couple of years, coming up on the 2-year anniversary, where I got a call and I was told that I had an older sister that I didn't know about.
Oh.
In the world of things, this has been an absolute blessing. I've lived the best case scenario, but I guess the only way it could have been better is if her last name was Buffett or Bezos. But setting all that aside, I definitely won the lottery.
And what's her first name?
Yeah, her name is Sheila, and she is 5 years older than I am.
Ah, God bless her.
In the last few years, I had just really had a longing sense of needing to go home where I grew up in Prescott, Arizona. This is 100 miles north of Phoenix. I hadn't really spent any time there since I had left for the Navy in '88. I think I had spent like one evening, but that was about it. And one of the things that had also occurred in the years since I had been gone was that I had another older sister named Cindy, and she had been killed in a horse accident when she was 5 and I was 2. And she finally received a headstone at her gravesite. So in February 2023, I headed west, and there were 2 components to the trip. The first half I spent with my sister, my newfound sister Sheila, and we went to our father's gravesite. This was the first time that she had ever gone because she had only found out 2 years ago who her father even was. We spent 4 hours at Dad's gravesite, and I was able to witness my sister as she talked to our dad, Jim, mourned, and was able to say goodbye. This was also glorious to be there with my sister for this experience. Additionally, we have a younger adopted sister, Debbie, who is an amazing woman as well. But for my sister Sheila, I am the only blood sibling that she has. So the first half of the trip was spending time with Sheila and her family.
Right.
The second half of the trip, I went to Prescott to spend time, and it was all about place. I wasn't there to see anyone. It was all about the place and to go back to the different locations just as a sense of remembrance. I went to Cindy's gravesite and spent extended time there, over 2 days. And I'm 54 now. And that was the first time that I ever really mourned Cindy's death. Because now there was a sense of place, right? There was a headstone. Before it was just a little beautiful blonde girl in pictures. And now there was a formal resting place. I'd done a bunch of other preps, but one of them had been asking my mom, I was like, what can you tell me about Cindy? She said that one of the things that she loved to do was to collect snails and put them in a bucket. So I bought a couple of brass garden snails. In one of the pictures that I hold dear is one where Cindy is holding onto my wrist, just as a big sister should, looking out for her little brother that may go rogue or something. And I epoxied these 2 brass snails onto the headstone in remembrance of my sister looking out for her little brother. With the epoxy, I expect those are going to be there for a little while, at least until they get knocked off from a lawnmower or some other visitor to the cemetery. But that remembering her and getting to tell her my life story, that I loved her, and just mourn the fact that I didn't have her for all these years. That was like the first time I had wept in years. But it was so healing. And now I do very much carry that experience with me. I guess that was probably the integration you mentioned, where now I would say that she is with me whereas previously she was just my sister that had died. But now we're moving forward together. I'm looking up at the pictures above my desk from that event. And so, yeah, remembering it's important.
What a beautiful, beautiful story, Ken. I feel privileged and honored to hear that story. And God rest Cindy's soul. And the image that came to mind is that you can now hold her wrist and you can take her forward. And brother and sister. Because I can imagine the anxiety that may have hit you prior to, what am I doing? Why? Where am I? And how welcoming you are for Sheila.
On the Sheila front, because of the work that I had done in this world of unlearning and challenging the myths of our country, I was a bit more prepared to learn about Sheila. And when I got the call from my younger sister, Debbie, I was like, I love you, Dad. I respect him for the man that he was, but I'm not holding on to any myth. I got ripped off a half a century of life with my sister, so I am all in, and I will go at whatever speed she's ready for, but I am all in.
Right.
I don't hold her responsible. None of this is on her. And so, yes, bring it all on. And it's just been, I've just been so blessed to have her as my sister and start the process of building that relationship as we go forward. It's been amazing.
How has the reintegration of both Cindy and Sheila into your life, how has that showed up perhaps in the world at large, in your, if it has at all?
Well, I think it goes back to, I said, there's a little bit of a sense of wholeness. And the best way I can describe this is that we have a family Bible that goes back to the late 1800s. Our dad was the youngest of 8 siblings. And when he passed 14 years ago, I guess now, it was passed on to me to carry it forward. Now, often with these family Bibles, there's a list of births, marriages, and deaths. And whoever had been maintaining the Bible when my sister Cindy was born had entered her name and a birth date. And I guess because she had died so young, whoever was maintaining the Bible at the time just put the death date right underneath the birth date instead of putting it over in the deaths, and this left a gap. So then the rest of the page was filled with new names and birth dates. Oddly enough, after this page after page list of births, there was this gap. And when I got the call about Sheila, I thought of the Bible, and I went back to it, and I looked at this as though the space was held for Sheila. So when we got together in February of 2023, I went through this process of acknowledging a great wrong had been committed against her, and I'm here to right that wrong. And so we went through a process. We had some family around, and I wrote her name into the family Bible. And then, because she is my father's eldest child, I said, the rightful person to hold on to this family Bible and to carry it forward and maintain it is the matriarch of my father's line. And so I gave it to her and trusted it to her, for carrying it on, right? And then it'll now get passed on through her lineage. She spent her life as an only child, and now 3 months after finding out she had siblings, she was the custodian of this family Bible with her name inscribed in it. But again, a great wrong had been done, and I was seeking to right that.
A great wrong had been righted.
So in the integration and processing Cindy's death, in this blessing of a new sister, right, all that comes in, and that page is now full.
What an incredible story. What an incredible story. What a brilliant and inclusive act that you did. And I imagine that Bible meant a lot to you.
It did. It's something that I've always known about, and having that lineage, because this is one of the many identities that has been shaken in recent years.
Right.
Whether it's the myths of America, the church, or the myth of the Woodward family. Although we're a great family, here is the truth. This woman stands before me who looks more like our father than I do. The reality is my father abdicated his position, his responsibility, and abandoned her. And I'd like to think, and I'm fairly certain, that if we would have found each other while he was living, I think that he would have embraced her. But he was stuck at that point where, having lived his whole life without acknowledging her, it was easier to take it to the grave.
So do you remember the question I asked before?
Yeah.
What would you have to give up that you love in order to set the world right? You gave up a position as a patriarch. You gave up a position as the keeper of the family Bible. You still hold the stories. God bless you for that. You still play an incredibly important role in filling in the gaps in the family tree. But you had to give up something that you loved in order for something that you love even more to come forward, which is that the family tree be whole and that Sheila have her rightful place, her inheritance, if you will. How biblical. How biblical in its rootedness and inheritance and descendants and ancestors. To use a good Yiddish word, you did a mitzvah.
In a world where I want to see healing, belonging, and community, it just very much hit me when I learned about Sheila. There are two things when I learned about her that immediately came to mind. One was just regarding the Bible that we spoke about, and the other was that when we got together, the thing I wanted to do was to sit across from her, put my hands on either side of her face, and talk to the 9-year-old little girl. Ooh, may get a little bit weepy on this one. Because I knew that there was no one else bloodline-wise that could communicate this to her. And so I said, sitting across from her, hands on her face, I said along the lines of, you are loved, you were wronged, and it is not your fault. You are desired. Your brother has always wanted you for all of your life. I love you. So I wanted to do my best to repair the damage the family had done by the abdication. And this was a demonstration, or what a demonstration of love looked like, right?
It's your work to do.
This is what love, or love for my sister, looks like. I'm the only one that can do that. It's just a sober recognition of the truth. And so those were the two gifts that I immediately recognized I had from my sister. And like I say, she's just a lovely person, lovely woman, lovely family. And I win in getting through that belonging and coming together and trying to right the wrongs of the past.
Well, she has a lovely brother, too.
Thank you. There's no easy way to move forward towards wrapping up, but wanted to return to the present. And I asked guests about a right now
He's a
question.
good man.
So this is something beyond what you're going to do for lunch. And if you're going to go back to college now at 61 or any of those other big questions. So what questions are you working through or living with right now that you would consider your right now questions?
Well, you know, I was actually journaling a little bit about this morning, not so much about this question, but about where I am right now. I have an older son. My oldest son, Sam, is 34, and he and his girlfriend were just visiting with us this weekend. And it's very clear that all of us in the system are in this sort of liminal space of another transition. And it's really lovely And it's a little disorienting. Emma, about whom I wrote in Reunion, my daughter who challenges me, she got married in September. My youngest son, who got married last December, he and his wife are on a trip to Japan today for 3 weeks. There's transitions all around. And so when I think about your question, what I think about is really, what is to become of me? Not in a woeful way, but just really out of curiosity. And what will I be like a year from now? That's the question.
Seems like a good question to sit with then.
Yeah.
Thank you. Do you have any other thoughts or encouragements about questions that we haven't explored? I have a list of 30 other questions, but we're going to have to wrap things up.
Maybe you should make them an addendum to the transcript or something. I would say just that what a delight it was to be in conversation with you. I anticipated it would be fun, but I did not anticipate that it would be so moving. And I really appreciated your approach and your questions and the way you helped me open up. And I'm admiring of that. So thank you.
Thank you. You're welcome, and thank you. Connection-wise, where's the best place for folks to engage with you and find out what you're excited about?
You can follow me on most of the social media, Jerry Colonna, Instagram, whatever. But Reboot.io is the website, and that's where we talk about programs and things like that. But, my own podcast and all that. As you can tell, I'm uncomfortable self-promoting. So.
Well, that's why you've got other folks for that. Okay,
that's
right? They'll build out all of that. Well, Jerry, thank you for sharing your work with questions and highlighting our role as co-conspirators in creating tomorrow's world of belonging. Thank you, sir.
Thank you for having me.
To all those on the other side of the speakers, I'm grateful you are here. Jerry gave us a gift. He provided a reminder and established a benchmark for belonging. This one will be worth a second listen to draw out all the lessons waiting for each of us. Our direct action is to take all you have learned here and be a light to yourself and those around you. Gratitude shout out to Beauty Pill for the show's music and producer Ben Ford for the technical help. This episode was recorded on Piscataway land. Please engage with this episode in some manner. Download, follow, save, like, share, or comment about something that resonated. This action ensures we are engaging the questioning community. Until next time, keep questioning.